All right, folks, welcome to the Technical Remediation Advisory Committee for Monday, December 9th, 2024. I wanted to start tonight's meeting with the land acknowledgement. The land on which we meet has been here from time immemorial. People have inhabited Southern Ontario for about 10,000 years, and we acknowledge the neutral people, also called the Andawannaron, the Anishinaabe, and the Haudenosaunee people who have lived here when settlers arrived and who share this land with us. May we together learn to care for and respect each other, our flora and fauna, and the land we inhabit together. Thank you. So item 2 on the agenda, we should start with, are there any disclosures of pecuniary interest? Seeing none, we do have minutes from our previous meeting in November. So are there any concerns with those minutes? And if not, can I have a mover and a seconder for approval of those minutes? Sebastian.
One slight adjustment for Stacy. Alan Deal, I think it's on page 4, presented on September 12th, not the 9th. As in the minutes. Those could be updated, I think. It's on page 4, I think.
Okay. Thank you, Sebastian. Pending that change, any other concerns?
No.
Seeing none, do I have a mover for approval on those? Thank you, Sebastian. Seconder, Eric. All those in favor? Not seeing Susan's video, but I'm going to hold. There we go. Okay, that has passed. Thank you very much. So we have no delegations tonight, but we have a number of updates. The first being 5.1. Jason with the ministry. I'm just going to call on you for any updates that you have for us.
Just adjust my screen. There we go. So for the ministry's floodplain soil sampling that we conducted late last year on some agricultural farms downstream of the LANXESS property, as of today, that information has now been delivered and discussed with the property owners. So tomorrow morning, I'll be emailing a copy of the fulsome report that ministry has prepared for the study to both LANXESS and TRAC.
Great.
Perfect. Thank you, Jason.
Yep.
Any thoughts from committee? All right, so that can be something that we'll have more fulsome discussion on then at our next meeting.
Okay.
Thanks, Jason. All right, Hadley, I know that there's a number of items under 5.2, so I'm going to turn it over to you with the recognition that you're going to slightly adjust the order of what's contained there in 5.2. So I will turn it over to you then.
Sure. I hope everybody's okay with introducing Rob first, our new plant manager. It just made sense to do introductions at the start.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Hadley. Hello, everyone. Thank you for your time tonight. Just wanted to introduce myself as the new plant manager in Elmira. Helder remains with LANXESS in a different role as an operational excellence manager traveling around North America. But I've taken over since September, I guess, his position in Elmira.
Can you plug that into the other one so this isn't so stressed?
Susan?
Yes.
Sorry, you're unmuted, Susan. Thanks. Go on.
Thank you.
Okay.
Brief background with myself. I'm 27 years with the facility. Started there as an operator, supervisor, 16 years as production manager, and now as the plant manager at the facility. So thank you for the time tonight to just meet you. And hopefully, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me.
Thank you, Rob. Thanks so much for coming here and introducing yourself. It's nice to know that you're familiar with the site and you bring a wealth of experience. So certainly welcome you here. Knowing that this is an introduction, are there any questions for Rob? Do we want to do a trial by fire here? Sink or swim? Or?
I think Rob will get a lot of questions over the next while. Yeah, absolutely. And the relationship and organization has not changed. I mean, Hadley has been up. We've met several times already. So no changes to that kind of function and responsibilities within LANXESS.
Well, welcome, Rob.
Thank you.
We're happy to have you here. Hadley, I'll turn it back over to you if you want to work through each one of these reports. And what I'd ask is when you move on to the next one, if you just let us know so that we can follow along on the agenda. I know for Stacy's purpose, it helps with tracking. So we will start with 5.2.1, which is year in review in the 2025 work plan.
Okay. I am just having some technical difficulties, so I might need you guys to help me keep up with the agenda because I can't see the screen either right now. So I'll start with the 2024 year in review. And are you showing my slides, Stacy?
I can share them now.
Yeah, we can get it up for you, Hadley.
Okay, but for some reason I've lost. Okay. No, I can only see a black box. It's on my end. It just said like, oh, there's a problem. You have to restart. And I don't want to waste everybody's time with that. So I'll start with the year in review. I can see my slides. I'm afraid I can't scroll back to the agenda. So if you could just help me after each slide to let me know what's next on the agenda, if that's all right.
Sure.
So this is what I think Ramin has always presented before, kind of like everything we've done on the system. And I'm not sure that it's helpful to go through each item, right? A lot of this is what's required from our consent order and the ECA, more importantly, about what helps us maintain our compliance. And it's things that we talk about, and then it's also in the monthly report. So I just guess I have it up. If anybody has any specific questions, I can try to answer them. Or if there's anything that people want to focus on, let me know.
Is there any of the bullets, any of the points that members of the committee do wish to pull for discussion? And bear with us, Hadley, it might just take the committee a moment as they kind of navigate the list.
Well, I feel like this is a shock and awe personally, like bullet list, right? Like I've actually kind of taken it out, but it sounds like maybe people just want to know everything we do. And I've talked to Rob and other folks at the plant, and we are anticipating in the spring, summer to maybe do a site walk with a handful of folks to just see really what it means. Because to me, like hearing about a Rayox UV system or the Trojan UV ballast or replacing a feed tank pump is really meaningless, right? Until you see the system. And I'm not sure people have had that opportunity at open houses or whatnot. But we're open to bringing people into the facility and seeing it, because I think to me it's large, right? It's the size of what a town would have for a drinking water system, because it's kind of the same thing. So I think it might be more meaningful, instead of going through all of this, to actually kind of show people what it is.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. And in all fairness, I think for members of this committee who are reviewing the monthly progress reports on a regular basis, kind of seeing the year in review is maybe nothing new. Maybe it's more a summary of what those progress reports really look like. So, yeah, Tiffany.
Hadley, I didn't have a chance to just cross-reference the work plan for 2024 with this list, but were there any, like maybe you did, and I'm just wondering if there were any items that were on that work plan that may have either not been completed yet, or were there things that were added that weren't on the work plan?
So I think Lou is on the phone by phone, and he's having some trouble too with getting things to load. I might let him answer. I think that the replacement well is still not quite running, but so that I know that would be one that comes to my mind. But I think it's very close. So if Lou, if you can hear us, if you could chat and talk, that might be helpful too, to kind of answer Tiffany's question and also tell me if that well's running.
It's Alan, actually. Lou
Okay.
and I did talk about this morning, so in case he can't answer, what he told me is he has to do the final safety inspection on Friday. So the target would be to turn the well on next week.
Okay, is there anything else from this list that jumps to mind that maybe isn't done or hasn't been completed?
First time I've seen it, so.
Okay, that's fair.
Well, abandonment discussions with MECP. That might have been a holdover from 2023, where we have discussed abandoning the upper aquifer containment system wells, some of the old ones. But other than that, I can't really see anything.
Sorry, I
That
just
Lou?
wanted
That's
to add,
Lou.
yeah, I'm on the phone. Sorry, I can't get in on my computer, but we are still waiting for the revised permit from the MECP for the new UACS wells. That's why that's on there. We haven't gotten the final permit yet.
But it's not a rush, right? This is not anything time sensitive or
No,
critical.
no,
Okay.
it's just outstanding, and we do need it, and it's just something that we're waiting for from the MECP.
And the technical review has already been done and accepted, so it's just this permit is more of a formality at this point through approvals branch.
And abandoning wells is not compromising the system integrity either, right?
No.
So, okay. Good question.
So I just pulled up the 2024 work plan as presented on December 7th, 2023. And just like trying to cross-reference here, completion of 6 replacement upper aquifer containment system extraction wells in 2023, was that completed?
Yeah, all that work, Tiffany, has been done. We're just,
Oh.
the only thing that's outstanding is the permit itself.
Okay.
And again, everything's been agreed to by, I mean, the MECP. We've provided all the information to the MECP. We've had discussions with them on the permitting side. We're just literally waiting for the paperwork to come through. That's all that remains to be done.
Okay, thanks.
Perfect. So Hadley, is this kind of leading into your 2025 work plan as well? Is that a separate slide?
Okay. I think I'm going to default to Lou too again on this one. A lot of it's
Yeah.
things that are. Go ahead, Lou. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I'm sorry. So these are things that were historically presented to RAC to the committee. Again, just to give a sense of everything that is kind of being done with respect to the operation and maintenance of the extraction, collection and treatment system, but also all other work. You know, the AMRs on there. In this case, for 2025, we're looking at those additional studies that were discussed with members of TRAC in September. The aquifer testing, the bench scale testing. So it's a lot of ongoing, we call it operations and maintenance work, plus any new work we've discussed or committed to, or LANXESS has, committed to for 2025. And again, I think this level of detail was brought in at one point because we really weren't telling the community what was involved in maintaining the system, but maybe it's, the usefulness of this detailed list has run its course and everyone kind of understands now that all these activities are taking place with ongoing operations and maintenance of the system. And maybe there's a better format, or maybe we can focus on new work. I'm not sure.
Yeah, what do you think? Hadley's not super fond of this list. I mean, I'm going to do it. I'm not going to do it. It's just so much. It's too hard to take in personally, even kind of for me in a way, because things that we have a schedule, right? So this is kind of showing our quarterly schedule, our biweekly schedule, our monthly schedule, and when you see it this way, it's just overwhelming personally. Maybe that's me.
Right. I'm just going to go to Sebastian real quick. I do see a hand.
Actually, Tiffany, did you have a question?
I still think it has value because without going through each of the ECAs and the orders and so on, it sort of nails it down on one slide. And it is a quick check just to make sure that anything, like, I find it a helpful list. But.
Okay.
I would echo that. I mean, you take a look at the year review and the planned work for 2025. It's pretty comprehensive. You realize from that list just how much work is involved. But I'd like just to maintain or mention here, all of this, of course, is with operational issues, so current issues. What's missing in either of these lists are any sort of references to longer term planning.
that isn't operationally focused on the CTS. And I think that needs to be part of both of these lists, that there needs to be some work on what has to be done down the road, not just in the coming year.
Okay, maybe, so if you look at the bottom one, the bottom on the right column, a lot of those are what the items, right, that we're collecting data next year is how I see it, to help us understand what remedial alternatives we might want to move forward with, and also updating the conceptual site model. So those are all pieces to get to the new control order, right? We need to answer that information, but I understand your point. And I guess as I look at this, I have a amendment I might want to make, right? It says preparation and submittal of the final Creek human health risk assessment. I don't think that'll be a 20, I'm sure it hurts everybody to hear this. It kind of hurts me to say it, but I don't think we'll be there in 2025. We've had good discussions with the ministry to really focus on what is still lacking to get consensus on the science, where they see it, where we are being LANXESS and the risk assessors that I'm working with. And I think there's a slide on this, I can't remember, that it probably, and this is even going to be maybe news to Jason, it's going to involve resampling, right? We're going to have to go in and look at where there still are higher detections in the soil and the sediment, and maybe do some characterization, like step outs in all direction from those locations, and do resampling. And that'll basically be a new submittal of a new risk assessment, right? Version 3.0, right, is kind of where we are. So I don't know, because all that will be dependent on approval of our work plan, completing the field work, and getting the data in, and then getting it written and submitting. And I don't know if that is a 1-year project yet or not.
Okay. Thanks for that update. I mean, from my perspective, I would echo what has been said. I think that it's helpful to have this information in one spot. I certainly welcome any enhancements that you could make to it, Hadley, and others. But I would hate to see this discontinued.
Okay.
Any other thoughts on your review or the 2025 work plan? Yeah, Eric?
Yes, just following up on the discussion, I agree. I like the list. What's perhaps missing is the list isn't subcategorized very well. So, trying to address comments, there's a section on operational. That's really on the 2025 work plan. That's the left side, and the same with the reporting of the year in history. There's an operational side, there's a reporting component, and then there's specific components related to the areas of focus that we're interested in the committee, which is the human health risk assessment and the aquifer cleanup. So, there's a number of things: update of the contaminant site model, update of the remedial alternatives, completion of Benskia. Those are all part of the work that's going into the aquifer cleanup, the municipal aquifer cleanup. So if there was a subtitle that's sort of related to all the things that were related to that, that would be very helpful, because then it would sort of get at the comments on where the longer term planning is. Well, all these things fit into that. So
I like that suggestion.
The suggestion is sort of break the list up into a number of more easily manageable components. So if I wanted to quickly look at it and say, okay, well, what operationally was done to the containment system or to well W6, then I could go to that list that refers specifically to that. So just for consideration.
That makes sense. I like that suggestion. Thank you.
Yeah, one that should be relatively easy to implement well, and
yeah,
definitely add value. So thanks for that, Eric. Any other comments on this one before we move on? Eric?
Yeah, just going back, I think a year ago this time, maybe a year and a half, we had a lot of conversation on hotspots at this committee and the benefit of going ahead and removing some or not. I think at the time, LANXESS was looking at removing some, but there's some sort of discussion about the clam trial, whether or not that was going to go ahead, and that seemed to be slowing the process down. Is the project involving removing a few hotspots being contemplated at this point, or where are we at there?
So you're talking about the creek, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. I am waiting to try to get to a resolution on the human health risk assessment with the ministry, right? I need them to accept it, because the outcome could be some removal of targeted areas. And I want to make sure I get the areas that they agree with, right? So you know, I'm new to the site. I know Ramin has said to Susan, we will do something, and I'm still standing behind that. I just want to understand if the ministry is going to ask us to do something and make sure I do what they ask as well. So I feel it's important to get through an approved risk assessment before we do any removals on the creek. And I've worked on creeks, right? I mean, this is my passion, right? I got into this business because I love being outside. I love being in nature. And when I've seen work done on creeks, it's always very destructive. So I don't want to just do it for doing its sake, because it's, you know, you're moving heavy equipment into a water body, and sometimes you're taking down trees, you're putting down swamp mats so you can get the equipment out there. It sometimes leaves a scar. So I want to make sure we're doing the right thing and not just something.
Thanks, Heather. Not seeing any other questions or comments, so if you want to move on to item 5.2.2, which is an overview of the pilot test work plan.
Okay. So we've submitted this to the ministry, and I think I went over it pretty high level at our last meeting. And you can see on the figure, there are certain wells that we plan to basically turn off for a few weeks. I think it's up to 8 weeks. Is that right, Lou? Total.
That's correct, yes. Yeah.
The wells that we would shut down are orange, and then on green is stay on, and then the offsite wells are in kind of a different color. I don't know what we want to call that. Is that gray? I'm having a hard time seeing it on my screen.
I think
so,
it's black, and then
okay.
E7 is on as well, Hadley.
Right. So the farthermost southern right well is still stays on to make sure we keep containment. So the point is to really let the rest of it kind of ease back up to a steady state conditions, because as we're extracting, we're pulling the water down and we're creating an artificially low water table. And we know what the concentrations are in that water table, but where is it back at a steady state without all of the extraction, right? So we'll be monitoring it. We'll be going out and collecting groundwater samples and also field samples, which will be very important to tell us pH, conductivity, you know, oxygen in the water, in order to help us understand what attenuation, what additives, or is there something that we can help to make the chemical breakdown of the NDMA in place go quicker, and where also is it at the highest concentration at a steady state. So we plan to do that upon agency ministry approval, right? And also take rounds of groundwater elevation, so we understand where the steady state is a little bit. And all of that information, as I said, will be going into helping us with the remedial technology screening evaluation. Are there questions? Does that make sense?
Yeah, thanks. Question from Tiffany here.
Thanks, Hadley. I am assuming that from these field activities and the evaluation of the active testing, that you would be able to answer, or maybe you already have this information, how like homogeneous the aquifer is, municipal upper and lower aquifer are, and maybe have a way of analytically determining the outstanding question that we have around the target pumping rates and how long it would take, or what the threshold is for containment maintenance. I'm just wondering if that could be part of the aquifer testing, that you get to a point where you can kind of say, you know, I realize how these target pumping rates were established and that we are monitoring containment, but to answer the question, like how long would these like wells need to be turned off or be reduced pumping rate? Like you have the model. I'm just wondering how you can maybe answer that question as part of it.
Hadley, if I
Yeah, you
I
or
can
Alan,
take
please.
one,
Mhm.
or yeah, Alan or I can answer this, Hadley, if you want.
Yes, yep.
Go ahead, Lou.
Yeah. So with respect to containment, we have a mandate and a requirement from the ministry to contain on-site groundwater. So that was not part of this testing. We were planning to keep the on-site containment system operational throughout this entire program, this 8-week program that we're talking about here. So we were not going to evaluate on-site containment as part of this, and really the issue is just, we need to make our best efforts to contain groundwater on site. It's just part of the order, and it's a requirement to contain on-site groundwater. So that was kind of off the table with respect to this aquifer testing. With respect to off-site wells, the pumping rates themselves have been established literally in the field by testing the wells. And we do have the model as well, but I don't believe that was, I don't think that answers the question, Tiffany, you were asking, which is on-site containment, like when we lose it, how long it takes, what are the actual rates? Those are the questions you were asking, correct?
Yep.
Correct, yeah, and I was just wondering if you were pulling out the model and working with it in this capacity, how easy it would be to answer, how involved would it be to answer the question that's been asked?
For on-site containment?
Or on-site?
We've not used the model, Hadley, for on-site. The model has only been used for off-site groundwater remedy purposes, like to treat the off-site aquifer. The model itself, and Alan, jump in if I'm wrong, but the model is always focused on off-site and doesn't deal with on-site, because again, the fundamental requirement is to contain on-site groundwater, and that's just a condition of the control order.
And I wasn't clear when I started to discuss this either. I think I stressed it at the last meeting, but we're keeping the on-site containment wells operating. So really to understand that differential of how much they should pump before we lose containment is a different study. We're not touching the on-site containment, that the on-site is still where the massive contamination is, and we don't want it to move. We don't want to relax pumping it. So we're not looking at that at all. When we do that, it's a different study when we have lost containment, right? When one has been down for a long time. What is the water level that tips the scale? I don't know how else to say it. So that's maybe something I've kind of put on Alan to say, can you help us? Can we look at it? Can we look at what are the two elevations we need to maintain before the scale tips the other way? But that's not at all related to this. On this, we're for sure keeping the on-site containment wells operating.
Okay, so I guess, in separate from this, we're trying to populate the, Waterloo Region engage, information for this work. And, in doing so, we look back over some of the historical regulatory documentation. And so I know that there was some work related to this when the ECA allowed for some of the on-site groundwater to be captured by the closest off-site pumping well. So I'm assuming some of the preliminary thinking around this must have been done as part of that work. So I'm glad to hear that you're still working on sort of coming up with an understanding of what the tipping point is around that.
I'm not familiar with that. Yeah, I don't know if Alan has anything to.
So I think what you might be talking about is in 2000, there was an amendment to the ECA, and essentially we were containing the entire property line, the entire western and southern property lines. But there's large stretches of those that don't really have very much or zero contamination. So the thought was, why are we trying to contain the clean portions of the site? And the original ECA just said on-site containment. It was not very nuanced. So after several years of operation, we wanted to switch from having extraction wells all along the edge of the property line to focusing in the southwest portion, where we now have PW 4, 5, and soon 6, because that's where the heart of the plume is. So that amendment was just to change the language of the ECA so that we could be more effective in terms of the containment. And when you're pointing to we had a contingency in there that if any of that groundwater was migrating off the site, the farthest it would go would be to the W5, to W5B. So as long as that well is contained pumping, technically the groundwater is migrating off site, but it's not migrating far off site, if I could put it that way. Hope that makes sense.
Yeah, that's exactly the ECA amendment I was referring to, the 2001. And so I guess like the question that is being asked around this each time we've kind of had this discussion is if we could have an understanding of the water levels that need to be maintained.
Yeah.
To ensure that that containment is, guaranteed to remain on site or captured by the well that is designated as being the well to capture the on-site groundwater moving off-site. That would be good.
So I have done I went back and I looked at the data that we had collected during the summer when we were having difficulties maintaining containment. So we did a couple of, I think there was 3 or 4 monthly measurements where we went out and we collected manual water level measurements at the key observation wells. And what I saw, just looking at that data today, was that when the pumping rate went below about 2.5 liters per second, that's when we started to lose containment. But I just want to say a couple caveats on that. It really also depends on what's going on off-site, because it's always going to be a tug of war between on-site and off-site. So as those off-site pumping rates increase, the pumping rates on-site have to increase the same, not directly, but they do have to increase to try and maintain that containment. So for example, right now we're pumping the individual PW4 well, I think it's around 50 GPM, like that ballpark, 50, 45, 55. But back in the day, back in the late 90s, before we turned on the off-site system, that well pumped at 8 gallons a minute. So with no on-site pumping, it's very easy to maintain containment of this, relatively easy to maintain containment of the site. As those off-site pumping rates go up, it becomes more and more harder or more difficult. And the other thing is they're changing. Like we'll shut down a well for a while, we'll turn a well up for a while for all these, maintenance reasons and whatnot. So it is a very dynamic situation. And if I could give you 2 water levels that you could look at and know that that was containment and that wasn't, I would dearly love to do that. But it's just a little bit too complicated.
Thanks for that, Alan. I know that it is quite complex and, having a simple metric is difficult, especially just one. I'm wondering maybe though, if even a ratio or something, if you're saying that it depends on a number of factors, presumably one being the level of precipitation, for instance. Well, how does that impact, how we have to pump in order to maintain containment? And again, I know that this becomes quite complex and maybe beyond the scope of what we're able to actually figure out with the data that is available to us. But I think that, if we can continue to make efforts to, bring light to some of this information, it could be to the benefit of everyone to really understand the containment numbers. So I will open it up if there are any questions or comments. Sebastian?
Yeah, tangentially to this argument, I just look at it from a conceptual point of view, and you're interested in determining the flow rates, groundwater flow rates off-site, which is commendable. I mean, you need to know that. But you don't do that for on-site. And I'm just wondering how that works, because if you can determine how much water has to flow off-site onto on-site in order to have a containment, why wouldn't you need to know how much the receptor, the onset, could actually absorb? How much water needs to move on-site in order to make the off-site containment possible? Conceptually, I just don't understand why you wouldn't do research or studies on what your on-site flow rate needs to be. I don't understand how you can get the one side but not know what the other does, because the two are interlocked. And if you don't know what the other can absorb from the flow rate that you're expecting offsite, then how does that work? How does that even work? I don't quite understand that.
I'm afraid I don't understand your question, Sebastian.
I think, Sebastian, if I can, again, the goal on site is containment. The study itself, with respect to treating the offsite municipal aquifer, is offsite groundwater. That's why we're focused on offsite here as part of this aquifer testing. We want to be able to use this information to help advance the offsite groundwater remedy. That's why on-site isn't a focus here, but also the goal for the on-site system has always been and will always be to contain on-site groundwater. And again, I do want to point out that the ministry has required not only, pumping rates be monitored, water levels be monitored, but there's sampling that's triggered as well when we start to get close to or start to see levels that aren't ideal. The ministry is requiring sampling to assure not just them but everyone else that there aren't any offsite issues resulting from these incidents, and all that's contained in the last couple of AMRs and also in progress reports as well. So again, I just clear that the focus here is offsite, and that's maybe why there is some confusion. This data will be used for the offsite groundwater remedy.
I sort of see this as sort of an equation. On the one side you have offsite, on the other side of the equation you have onsite. And if you want to contain the onsite material, and you do so by pumping material out of the onsite, then you've got a pretty good idea of how much water from offsite you can take. And those need to be measured. And as far as I can make out, you've only measured one side of the equation. I don't understand why you don't measure the other side. Because if you did measure the other side, you should be able to calculate fairly simply how much flow you can take from the one in order to make sure that the containment on-site is maintained. To speak of complexity, yeah, I'm not saying this isn't easy. But you've got two sides. You've got on-site and off-site. And you should be able to measure both sides to determine an optimal allocation of either in order to maintain sort of equilibrium on-site. And yet you're telling me you don't do that on-site. And I don't understand why that is.
But it's not a simple equation where the right side equals one equals the other, Sebastian. I mean, on-site, the upper aquifer on-site is highly influenced by the creek and the levels in the creek, and it's a different unit. It does communicate also with municipal aquifers underneath the plant, but then as you move further off-site, there is an aquitard. And those municipal aquifers are not as affected by the by the creek and the surface water elevations in the creek. And again, there's infiltration. There's a whole other, there's other processes and mechanisms going on with regards to recharge of those municipal aquifers. So it's not a simple equation where one equals the other, or you can establish a direct linear relationship between the two.
Carl, I see your hand popped up during that discussion.
Yeah, thanks. I don't want to belabor this or anything, but there was something brought up, and I was just trying to kind of connect the dots between all these things. And I recall that W5, I think is W5 or W5A, is being replaced with that W6 well, and both of those are on-site wells, I believe. And I think that's where some of this issue around containment may be stemming from in the more recent discussions, because there were the capacity of wells. This is just something that happens in groundwater systems. When you have wells, they degrade over time, and it just adds to the complexity of trying to maintain wells operating at particular rates, is that the well's performance declines over time. That's something we see in municipal supply wells. It's something you'll see in any remediation well. And so I think once this new well comes online, there'll be adequate well capacity to be able to contain the on-site water much better. That's my understanding of how this is going. So I just wanted to confirm that with you guys, that's with GHD, that's what's going on site. And I remember there was discussion of a replacement permit to take water, and is that to add this W6 well to the permit? And is that why W6 isn't being started up yet? Is it waiting on the permit to be able to start it, or is it a different reason?
So two questions. Sorry, the first answer is PW6 will replace PW5. It is the southernmost on-site containment well. That is correct. And the idea is that we recognize and acknowledge that PW5 is coming to the end of its useful, serviceable life. It's still operating and continues to operate, but over time, its performance has dropped. So yes, PW6 will be the replacement for 5, and the goal is, as you had indicated, that we'll continue on with on-site containment with PW6. And then with respect,
and then it should be easier to maintain containment, right?
Yeah,
with the additional capacity.
We'll have a new well. We shouldn't see, if things behave as they are expected to, this well should provide years and years of adequate pumping for that area of the site. And then with respect to permitting, again, we've talked to the ministry. They're aware, and they're not going to hold us up from starting the well. I think we provided them with the information, and it's in the new permit. But again, there's nothing on the permitting side that's going to hold us up for turning this well on once it's up and running. And we are planning to commission that as early as this week, as late as next week.
All right, perfect. Thanks for that, and thanks for the question, Carl. I think that it does add some clarity around, why this question originally came up and why it continues to be a point of contention for the committee. I know that we do have 5.2.8 on the agenda that does speak to the well replacement, so I'm just going to put a placeholder in that for now and make sure there's no further questions with the overview of the pilot test work plan that we've been talking about. All right, Hadley, if you want to move on to item 5.2.3, which is the 2018 technology evaluation update finalized. And I believe this one from GHD.
Yep, it is. It's all for Alan. Thank you.
I'm sorry, was I supposed to speak to this slide?
These are, I think, this the slides that GHD added. So mine was a bit of a placeholder to just talk, or maybe Lou, I'm sorry, I might have misspoken, to talk about the
No,
2018 that we finalized the report.
Yeah, so the 2018 report was issued, just a bit of history, that the 2018 technology evaluation report was issued as a draft but never finalized. And I believe the commitment from LANXESS was to finalize this document, and then really reevaluate or look at again anything that can be done with respect to remedial technologies offsite and municipal aquifers. So the report has been finalized, and it was submitted to the community and to the ministry. Just the the outcomes and the conclusions of the report were that there was a potential for chemical oxidation to be evaluated offsite, and that was considered, and the bench scale study did arise from this, and it was evaluated and tested in and around the W3R extraction well. And those reports were also issued back. I don't know the dates on those. I think they've been 2019. I don't have the exact dates in front of me, but again, it was just to finalize this document, but also to recommit to reevaluating remedial alternatives for the offsite groundwater remedy, which LANXESS has committed to and is starting to work on with these new studies that are proposed for this year, next year.
Right, thanks, Lou. So yeah, again, this is an item that came forward just before our last meeting. And so I had asked that it remain on the agenda to allow committee members sufficient time to review and ask any questions that they may have. So with that said, is there any questions or concerns from members of the committee on the 2018 technology evaluation update that's been finalized? Seeing none, thanks very much. So Hadley, I know this one's GHD as well, but it's the LANXESS's response to TAG, TRAC, and TRAC questions that have arisen.
Yeah, if I can, I'll start on this. I know that there are, I know, Stacy, there's another presentation. I don't know if you can, I'm sorry, I don't see the screen. I'm on my phone, but I do have it here, and I can step through the TRAC outstanding questions. Stacy, I don't know if you can switch over to that presentation and put that up.
Now, so it looks like it's up.
Okay. So I guess the first, there were 5 questions that Tiffany had kind of identified to us that she'd like us to reevaluate and reconsider and provide updated responses to, and those questions, hopefully the 5 questions are being shown. So the first, if I can just jump into the first, is the gap area. And really what we're trying to do here with this is kind of go over the evaluation of the gap area. I know there are questions about where the gap area is and isn't, and we can, once we've gone through these slides, we'll stop and maybe take questions on gap. But again, it's so the whole site, I guess I want to just start with the whole site was evaluated, the whole property, the production side, the historical waste management areas. Essentially, everything was looked at a very high level. Historic documents were reviewed, and interviews were conducted. Phase 1 assessments were completed, phase 2s were completed, and from that historic document review and those initial characterizations and studies, this area didn't present, or the gap or that east, I don't know if it's, we can talk about where it is and isn't, but the gap for now just didn't present as an area where there was any actual production or any historic waste management being completed or happening in the gap. And then as part of that, though, it was still evaluated to some extent. It wasn't evaluated maybe as much as, historic waste management areas and production areas were, but there were still a number of samples, soil, groundwater, sediment that have been collected kind of in and around the gap. And those were completed in 2002, 2011, 2015, 2022. I think the other point that when we look at the gap is that topographically it is a higher elevation than a lot of the surrounding land. So, it drops off to the formal gravel pits to the west. It drops off to the drainage feature on the abutting eastern property to the east, and it drops off to the creek to the south, and to the north. Again, it's slightly higher, but that's really what we're seeing from a topographical area. And then we also looked at the aerial photographs for the gap as well as part of this reevaluation. So we've got multiple lines of evidence that we want to take you through when we look at the gap. If you can maybe switch to the next slide, just the topography. Again, just showing you here on this slide shows you, I know, Sebastian, you've indicated that the test pit, that pinkish square near the property boundary, is kind of the central area of the gap. If that's where we focus on and that's where we look at. So it is topographically high or higher than a lot of the areas surrounding it. And then you can see historic sample locations kind of in and around the gap that have been completed over time on this slide. If you can just advance to the next slide, Stacy, the aerial photographs. So when we looked at aerial photographs of the gap, it's that forested wooded area on the east side of the plant. I know these photographs are orientated in a kind of east-west fashion. Sorry about that, but it's just the way they've been presented here on the slide. But you can definitely see the forested area, the heavily wooded area, as kind of representing the gap area. On the first 1930s side, you can see actually the plant is there, but it's quite small. There's a couple of buildings on the west side of the creek. There's nothing on the east side of the creek. When you look at, and then you see the forested area further to the east. You can see some standing water in gravel pit. I believe that's GB1 as well. When you look at 1955, you can start to see the plant property develop. There's more buildings. There's a lot more activity happening there. And you can kind of see the impoundments as well, the wastewater ponds that were used to manage wastewater historically at the site. But again, you can see that wooded area is essentially untouched, and there's nothing happening there in 1955 as well. Stacey, if you can just advance it again one more to the 1964-2016. Again, you can see in the 1964, you can still see the wastewater ponds. There's now some ponds on the west side as well as the east side. The wood lot or gap area is still there. And those are really the only significant changes. And then in 2016, again, you can see the wood lot still there. You can kind of see the drainage feature that we always discuss that's on the neighboring property to the east. And you can see the containment building, but obviously all of the historic waste pits and ponds have now been closed on the 2016. So when we look at this, when we look at these aerial photographs, we can easily determine that there hasn't been a lot of human activity within that wooded lot. There don't seem to be any access roads. There don't seem to be any areas that are cleared. We don't see any scarring of the trees or the vegetation. It's present in all of the photographs. And it just supports the conclusion that it's not an area where there's been much, if any, activity with respect to humans or production or waste management. So the photographs kind of, conclude or support the conclusion that the gap is not an area that a lot of activity has happened historically. And then when we look at the, you just go back to maybe that topography slide. When we look at the testing that's been done in and around the gap, again, a lot of the testings have been completed for DDT and docks and furans. Those are the predominant soil constituents of concern on site. Those are the constituents that we find in soils at the highest concentrations. And those have been the focus not only for on-site soils, but for sediments and soils in the creek and along the banks and in the floodplain. And we look at the gap, we look at TP, the test pit and the official soil samples collected in and around the gap area. Again, those represent some of the lowest concentrations we've seen on site. And when we look at the sediment samples that were collected from the drainage feature on the abutting eastern property, the DP2 and the DP1, those are more in line with the sediment concentrations that we see in the creek closer to the Grand River. Again, so not a lot in terms of dioxins and furans and DDT in that drainage feature. So sampling in and around the gap also leads us to believe that, again, nothing significant or nothing of any significance has occurred kind of in this area. And that lines up with the historic photographs and ties in with topography, right? We're not seeing a lot of runoff. We're not seeing, materials washing over this area or pooling in this area. It's a high level area. And again, this is why we believe, or we've concluded, that the gap area is not a significant area of concern with respect to the site. And I'm going to stop there because I know, Sebastian, you likely have some questions and some comments.
Well, and to that point, I know that Sebastian had shared a number of follow-up comments with everybody. So thank you for that, Sebastian, and having everybody get eyes on that in advance of this. With that being said, I will open the floor to you if you want to speak to anything that you heard there, or perhaps anything that you put in that email.
How long do we have?
We're getting there.
I'll try to keep it reasonably short here. It's not that Lou doesn't have some very good points here. I understand that the paucity of information or results leads one to the conclusion that really there's been no historic contamination there. The reality is, however, there probably has been. And my counter argument is that if you don't look for it, not surprising that you won't find it. And there are two basic issues here I think we need to focus in on. One is the exact location of the gap. There seems to be some ambiguity about that, and I don't understand exactly why that is. Because the gap is not connected with GP1 or GP2, gravel pit 1 or 2. Is in that area, if I can point it out with my pointer, on the east side, and Eric, I promise I won't singe your hair, but it's that area right there. That's the gap. And this has been called the gap by the former CPAC. Sorry, I'll just point that out again. It's that area right there.
To interrupt, but since I can't see the slides, can you, or the pointer, can you try to show me? I'm looking at the map. Can you try to tell me by a feature?
If you look, Hadley, on the eastern border, which is that blue line, you look at SS20 and SS21. That's those demarcation points that break down that eastern property line. And the gap is right next to that.
Okay.
Okay.
So
on the eastern side. On the eastern side. If you see
can I just want to, at this point, I want to say, I know that members of the committee, past committees, I should say, were invited out to tour this area and to tour the gap. And that was done a couple years back. And I know we looked at it, and I know we stood kind of right along that property boundary where the fence, there's a barbed wire fence that runs through there. I know it seems improbable, but there is a fence there through that heavily forested area. We stood right on SS21, and we pointed to SS20. And I do want to point out that that both those samples, those are composite samples right along the property line. Both of those samples were non-detect for both dioxins and purines and DDT and its metabolites. And I believe at the time when we did that inspection, someone said, well, where did you sample? Why didn't you sample here? And then I believe we just literally were a meter or two off of where that question was raised. Like, we are right on that boundary. These are the lowest levels. These are not detectable for dioxins and purines and DDT along that SS20 and SS21.
Okay, but you recognize that is the gap. It has nothing to do or directly related to GP1, GP2.
Yeah, GP1, GP2 are only provided as a frame of reference. We've never confused GP1 or GP2 with the gap at all. We've provided that data just to, again, show the difference between levels in the gravel pits, which we know received, water from in the swale from the ponds to the north. But the swale ran along closer to the creek in a north-south orientation, closer to the creek. And there's where we see the higher concentrations of dioxins, furans, and DDT. And that fits with our understanding of, again, what was done with respect to historic waste management practices.
Well, at least we've clarified that the gap is in fact that area adjacent to SS21 and 20. That is the gap. And I understand you want to do comparisons between the non-detects at those areas and GP1 and GP2, or even closer to the creek, because of course they are very much larger. That, however, does not discount or mean that there are no furans and dioxins or DDT and its metabolites in the gap area. And the reason why I say that is that you don't have a lot of information, not a lot of evidence to substantiate that claim. The only well or sampling well that you have there is OW14, SI and D, standing for shallow, intermediate, and deep. And the indications there are that there were trace amounts of these items many, many years ago. But that is the only evidence that you have in that basically area. There are all the other wells here, the data are too far removed from the gap. They don't really belong there. You've really only got one source. And from that one source, you draw the conclusion that there's no issue. and get to the point here about historical wastewater management. It's true that officially there was no use of this area as a reservoir for wastewaters. That's absolutely true. The closest one to that is RPE 5 and 4, which on a daily basis until they were shut down around 1970, received roughly a swimming pool's size worth of wastewater. Since these RP pits were of certain size, capacity, a lot of that drained out, escaped down the swale, some of it heading down into GP1 and eventually into GP2. But I would argue, if you look at the topography of that and where the swales lie and where GP1 is, there's a, pardon the word, gap where some of that wastewater would have flowed not north-south, but north to east. Because you look at the topography, it slowly goes at the superficial level. It goes from, what is it, 346 meters down to about 345.5, and then 345. So there's a slight gradient superficially that leads us to the gap. So some of the wastewater that left RP 4 and 5 deliberately through the swale, which is not just north-south, but there's also an east-west swale there as well, that overflowed. Some of it managed to get into GP1, but also a good chunk of that ended up, I think, in what was then a swamp. That area of the gap was demarcated on all the maps as swamp. And I would argue that was deliberately. Yeah. Let me finish, Lou, please.
Yeah.
That was done deliberately. That was done deliberately to, of course, allow some of the contaminants to escape off-site through the gap. All of it didn't end up in the GP1, GP2. And I think that was deliberate because the swale did not actually extend all the way from the north to the GP1. Could have easily have fabricated or manufactured a swale that would have gone those extra 200 meters. Instead, it was left open so that some of the superficial wastewater ended up going southeast into the lower echelons or the lower topography of the gap.
Show us that on the aerial. I mean, I don't think the aerial supports that.
Yeah, if I as well, your theory, Sebastian, requires water to flow uphill, and I'm sorry, and I don't mean to be blunt, but water we know flows downhill by gravity, and your theory requires water to go uphill, and I just want to point that out. I don't know how
That's
to.
What the map is indicating.
Reconcile. Sorry, if I can, I don't know how to.
You yourself traveled that area with the rest of us. There was a party of about 15. We were in the gap area. That is a lower elevation than RPE 4 and 5. And it's also, of course, lower than the ridge which separates the gap from GP1. Water would naturally, superficial water would naturally flow from that north to the southeast and through the gap, easily as much as they would have flowed south into GP1. And you saw it yourself. The height of the gap is lower than RPE 5 and is lower than the ridge.
So Sebastian, I have another point. Aside from the water flowing uphill, the other point I have is that if your theory were correct, then we should have seen significant levels of dioxins and furans and DDT in the sediments in the drain, and we didn't see that. We don't see that. So your theory doesn't fit the data that we have.
And I would argue, with respect, Lou, the only data you have is from OW 14. You don't have anything else in that gap area. Historically, you've just written it off, and I think quite deliberately, frankly.
No, sorry,
but it's pausing here, and Lou, I will give you an opportunity to respond to that. I do want to remind everybody about decorum, trying to allow everybody sufficient time to respond to claims that are being made. Lou, before you answer, I'm wondering if I can ask Tiffany, and sorry to put you on the spot, but I know that this has come up in the past, and What has, and sorry for my being naive and new to the committee, but what has been discussed around this in the past from your perspective? And can you offer any insights that may help guide this conversation? Again, sorry to put you on the spot.
Well,
Sorry, Lou, I'm asking Tiffany, so I'll come
Oh,
back
I
to you.
apologize.
okay, so, we had 2 site visits. And, one of the things that we were focused on, and, I think TAG, with perhaps the exception of 1, maybe 2, agreed that the ridge, of about 50 centimeters high, there was a ridge that sort of extended around the southern part of the RPE 5, the southernmost retention pond. And the question was asked and discussed, like if the RPE 5 was so full that it was overflowing and flowing down to GP1, could it potentially have breached that ridge, that elevation of about half a meter, for this much? I don't believe I recall that everybody had a concern around that at the time from the site visit. Some still did. Then we were looking at the composite soil sampling along SS, right along that area that Sebastian indicated, delineated where the gap area of interest is. And I think for most of us, we felt the composite samples of non-detect were supporting the idea that likely we weren't going to see high concentrations in the gap area, but we don't have a sample that says there isn't. So then the additional line of evidence that we were looking for was what concentration do we have in the drain? And that came from the work that was done as part of the risk assessment screening. And so the sediment and soil results are there, and that's the DP2 is the one that's closest. So that's got concentration there, I think in 4.4 and a non-detect, if I'm reading this correctly here in the slide. Further on down, the DP1, I think, had a higher concentration than that. I think the DP2 was the lower of the 2 drain concentrations. I don't have it in front of me here, but unfortunately, but so there were concentrations, but we were waiting on and relying on the sort of assessment from the risk assessment to tell us with some confidence, with some additional confidence, that we don't have a source, because I believe that that's really the concern that Sebastian has. That currently, not historically, but currently, do we have a source sitting there and that could, under maybe extreme weather conditions, dislodge and move from that location? I think would be fair to summarize it.
Thanks for that, Tiffany. I appreciate that. And I guess the follow-up question that I have for you is that for next steps, then, is it a matter of waiting on the HHRA risk assessment to see what the recommendations are in that as far as sampling, or is that kind of separate and aside from this conversation that we're having?
I think it's related. I don't know if Sebastian, as sort of former Eastside champion, would be satisfied if there are additional samples in that creek. This is where I'm a little bit in the dark as to what the conversation has been with the ministry and LANXESS around what additional sampling. Also, I don't know specifically what samples the ministry might have taken. So tomorrow we should see that as possibly some additional. speaking personally, I feel that samples from that drain, additional samples would be helpful in answering some of lingering concerns around that in terms of the potential for future risk. Historically, who really knows what might have been there? But I think if I have heard over the years, what Sebastian's concerned about is that there's actually a source lying there in that area that could potentially be dislodged in the future.
And ultimately, we don't know because there's a gap in the sampling of that area. So I guess the natural question, and Lou, I'll direct this at you, and sorry for not coming back to you sooner. But is there anything that's precluding us from sampling this? And I know that I had gone back to I think it was a 2018 report around some of the samples that weren't able to be taken because of the gravel that was in the way. Is that what's kind of limiting our ability to take samples in this area?
No, we had envisioned 2 samples in the drain, and we collected 2 samples in the drain. There were no issues with respect to the makeup of the sediment in the drain. It was very fine material in both of those sample locations, easily sampled, no issues with access or ability to obtain those samples. And the only thing I can further add is that when Stantec evaluated again the sediment samples from the drain, they found them to be very similar to the sediment quality in the furthest reach of Canagajig, reach 1, I believe, the reach that is adjacent to the Grand River, where we see a very low dioxin-furan, DDT and its metabolites in terms of composition and content. So the risk in those areas were determined to be, no unacceptable risks were found in Reach 1 is I believe their initial conclusion. So again, that's what we're dealing with. And again, we usually are motivated by information and data. We definitely want to sample areas where we know things have happened. That obviously doesn't mean that we don't sample areas adjacent to or around, areas where historic activities have taken place. As you can see here, there are samples that were collected from the gap area. LANXESS can always evaluate to do more if they wish to, but there's no real data right now that's in front of me that would, kind of motivate us to do more. Not to say that LANXESS won't. LANXESS may do that.
It's also the ministry's discretion as well, right? Yeah. So I don't know if Jason has anything to add, but if there's reason to suspect we have a data gap, the ministry would also bring it to our attention.
Yeah, at least from the regulatory perspective, we don't feel that there is a significant data gap along this side of the property. Given the amount of characterization that was done on the east side property, we also to take into consideration some of the input from some of the former RAC-TAG members from years ago when we were dealing with the east side property. Was we asked LANXESS and GHD to prepare a more fulsome, multiple lines of evidence approach report to support the findings on the east side, and we found that acceptable. So
can that be recirculated by chance? If that was something that was shared with TAG RAC at the time, Jason, and you still have access to?
That report was generated by LANXESS and was publicly shared.
Yeah.
Yeah, we have the report. We can reshare it. I know Hadley will not have an issue with us either pointing to the
Right.
report or sending it in if people want to see it.
That might
But
be
again,
helpful.
it looks at the entire eastern boundary of the property. That's the report you're referring to, right, Jason?
Correct.
I just want to check, is that the 2018 report? That has the, the groundwater as well as soil information and the work plan in appendix A, I guess?
Yeah, I think it's the east side report, and yes, it's surface and groundwater, and I believe some subsurface as well. So, yeah.
Maybe just to make sure we're all talking about the same report, if you could forward that one more time, then, because there were quite a few reports that were on-site and off-site, and one additional off-site groundwater supplemental report. So if you could circulate the one that you're specifically referencing, or Jason specifically referenced, I think that would be helpful, just to make sure we're speaking to the same information.
Just a quick question.
Yeah, we can do that.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sebastian.
Is that the report that dealt with the east side remedial work that was undertaken to the east of RP 1, 2, and 3 primarily?
That would be the report that actually set the chain of events that led to the east side remediation on the adjoining property.
And can I just remind everybody that that was limited to basically the northern half or northern 2/3 of the east side property line? The gap again is not mentioned in that report, as I recall.
There are a number of reports, and yeah, there was an initial sampling event, and there were subsequent sampling events, Sebastian, again, where everything is the whole property boundary from line 86 down to the south east corner of the property, actually, and even the southern boundary were evaluated. So there was a final report that has all of that, the southern and eastern boundary of the site evaluated.
Not my recollection, but okay.
Yeah, and there are no areas that are along those two property boundaries, or there are no areas that were not sampled.
So the final report from LANXESS was issued to the ministry on March 2023, after a few iterations that occurred as a follow-up to the work done in 2020 and 2021. And then there was a revised report in December 2021. The final report was issued in March 2023. And you're right, Lou, it did bring in groundwater offsite wells to the south of the gap area, south of the southernmost portion of the site. All that line of evidence was brought into that report.
Yeah.
Thanks,
So
Chris.
we'll resend that. There's no, again, it's been, it should be in the community's possession. It's a public document, so.
Perfect. Thanks very much. Eric.
I'm starting the photography map and these aerial photos. I think Rob or Hadley had mentioned possible tour showing off some of the equipment for the group. Perhaps we could include a walk to the east side of the ends to understand it better. I'm better visualizing it once I've seen it and can put it in perspective.
Yep, absolutely.
And can I just, based on our 2 previous site visits, can I recommend that it's post-snow, pre-vegetation?
We can try. Yep. I was thinking spring, early summer, so
Yeah.
we'll try to get there before the veg.
We if we wait later on, it becomes a bit of a jungle, and it's difficult to traverse, especially the wooded area, which is what Tiffany is referring to. It becomes difficult to actually see
Understood.
anything or even come walk through. Yeah.
All right, Lou. I think that was question one that we've gone through. There's a couple more, right?
Yeah. Keep going. Off-site pumping rates. I guess, Alan, if you can maybe take this one, talk about off-site and on-site pumping rates and containment. I know that was on the agenda to talk about.
Sure. So I just put these together in response to some of the questions in Tiffany's email. So I think we said this before. When we went out and installed the extraction wells off-site, we tested them, and basically we set the target pumping rate to be 90% of the capacity that the well could pump. And the reason we did that is we wanted to make sure that we were getting as much groundwater out of the ground and treated as quickly as possible. The 90% recognizes that there's times when the wells are not pumping. So we would not be able to pump at 100% of the target capacity or the capacity, but we felt that 90% was the best, was a good option there. Next slide. So again, with respect to on-site pumping rates, they're based on, I guess what I would call is we have well capacity, which is what an individual well can yield, but the aquifer itself will also have a capacity. We installed, there was the 2000 ECA amendment, which allowed LANXESS to reconfigure the on-site containment system with respect to the municipal aquifer. So at that point, they stopped operating PW1 and PW3 and replaced them with PW5. And at that time, PW5 was able to pump, I'm going to say like 3 or 4 or 5 liters per second, and PW4 had a similar rate. But we found that when we turned them on, they essentially, after you got to about 5 liters per second, that was all the aquifer could produce. And then increasing the pumping rate at one well caused a decrease in the available flow in the other well. So that's where we were with the 5 liters per second. So that was essentially just split between PW4 and PW5 and using that target. I think that, I talked about earlier, looking at the data from this summer, we had around 2.4 liters per second was when we started to lose containment. So I think our 5 liters per second is a very generous target pumping rate that provides a high degree of safety when it is attained. So I think that's the backstory on those guys.
Perfect. Thanks, Alan. And I think that we naturally had a bit of a conversation around this item earlier, with Carl kind of noting that the replacement of this well should hopefully kind of alleviate some of these concerns that we have. But with that being said, is there any other comments or questions from the committee on this one? Sebastian?
Sure. Just to reiterate, Carl made a very good point. PW6 will be replacing PW5, and that should solve the problem as long as the flow rate of PW6 is at least equal to PW5. And if it isn't, Hadley mentioned that last time to that very same question. She said she thought it would, so the problem is solved basically. But I do want to come to Alan's point here about where the rate was set. And Alan seems to indicate that the rate was set on the basis of the capacity of the pump, not on the actual flow of water. Could you just clarify that, Alan? Did you misspeak, or was the rate set for PW4 and 5 based on the capacity of the pump and the interaction between these two pumps, or was it based on the actual water flow that was required to actually achieve containment?
So let's say that we were pumping PW4 at 4 liters per second, for example, and we bring PW5 online, and we don't turn it up to max right away. We start off slow, so maybe we go at 1 liter per second for a while, and that seems to work. The well will still produce 1 liter per second, and PW4 will do 4 liters per second. So then the next step would be to increase PW5 even more. So let's say we go up to 2 liters per second at PW5 and try to stay at 4 at PW4. Well, what we found was the well was no longer, not the pump, the well was no longer able to sustain that 4 liters a second, and it would go down to 3 because the water level in the well will drop into the pump interval, and then it'll start literally sucking air. So there's no more water to come out of the aquifer, and it's not a limitation of the pump. It is a limitation of the aquifer.
And Stacy, can you just go back one slide? Because if I'm not mistaken, Sebastian, the question that you're asking is related to this 90% and whether or not the 90% is based on the pumping capacity of the well itself, or whether or not that 90% is kind of that figure that they gave for containment. Am I misunderstanding?
A little bit, yeah.
Okay.
To be fair, I understand, you've got, the maximum pumping power of a pump is whatever it happens to be, 5 liters per second. And you want to put in a cushion there for servicing for maintenance. So you draw that line down by 10%. So instead of 5, it becomes 4.5 liters. Makes perfect sense to me. The question that I have for Alan is, was that rate set on the basis of the capacity of the pump, or was it in relation to the actual estimated water flow required on site to ensure containment? And that I'm not sure about, and that's what I'd like clarity.
Okay, sorry, go ahead.
No, you have the floor, Alan. I think that's just what we were seeking clarity on.
So you're asking me what's the off-site pumping rate that's going to cause the site to lose containment? I'm still very confused by your question, Sebastian.
Okay.
Go ahead, Sebastian. It's Lou. Yeah, I think Sebastian is asking about and this is just on-site, whether or not the rates were set based on containment or like establishing containment, or whether they're based on the capacity of the pump. And really the answer, Sebastian, is that it's actually based on the capacity of the aquifer itself. Both these pumps are in close proximity to each other, so they will interfere with each other. If you draw a lot of water from one, you'll be lowering the water level in the whole area and actually reducing the amount of water that the other well can pump. So and essentially here, what's happened is the rate has been set to almost 2 times what is required to achieve containment. Does that hopefully answer your question? It's actually set with contingency to achieve containment. So we look at what we need to get containment, and then we almost double it here.
Okay.
And the pump can do more. The pump could do more if there was more water to pump. The physical pump has more capacity than even these numbers we're talking about.
Good. Well, that's perfect, Lou. That answers the question.
Thank you, Lou.
It does mean then that you have an idea of the water flow required to achieve containment.
Yeah. Like I say, I think about from what we looked at this summer, right now, during these current conditions, it's 2.4 liters per second. When we hit that number, then we lost containment. But again, that caveat, there's a lot going on off-site. So if things change off-site, that rate will change as well.
Perfect, guys. You've answered my question. Thank you.
Yeah, and also I do want to point out that again, you got to remember that the surface water and the creek plays a big part in this as well. So under these conditions, right? But when we have high high surface water elevations, that also factors into it as well, a little bit, Alan, correct?
For the upper aquifer, yeah, but not for
Yeah.
for the municipal.
Correct. Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Thanks. Tiffany?
Just for the record, I have found the email from March 8th where the final east side report was provided to us. However, it does not look like it was circulated to all of TAG. Somehow it got missed. So I'm going to spare you the effort there, Lou. I'm going to send it to Stacy to circulate to everybody now. Just so that it's on.
Thank you, Tiffany.
All right, gentlemen, you have a couple more questions to get through. I don't think that there are any other comments or concerns from the committee on this one. No,
Okay.
not seeing any.
Yeah, so just with respect to, I believe Hadley, the next question, just responding to revisiting and responding to TAG's written responses to the human health risk assessment. So obviously that's currently being reevaluated by LANXESS and the ministry, and there's discussions about additional work and sampling that need to play out. And then once those are done, obviously the hotspots will be, reevaluated and a final determination will be made on that. Is really the only update we can provide at this.
But we'll continue to keep the TRAC's written response into consideration. We'll definitely take those into consideration as we move forward.
Okay.
Yeah. Sorry, I'll just wait if there are any questions.
Seeing any.
Okay. Effective solubilities. There's a question about effective solubilities. And again, if we use the 1% rule to, evaluate DNAPL, presence of DNAPL in off-site and on-site. And I know that there's been a response provided, and we'd like to go through that. I think, Alan, if you want to just touch on the 1% and what we used and what we didn't use and how we evaluated the DNAPL, and then I'll follow up with effective solubilities.
Well, I didn't use the 1% rule. I talk about it a lot because everybody else likes to point to it, but I don't like to call it a rule. If I do, I call it a rule of thumb. I recognize that when concentrations of certain solvents are quite high, that they can be evidence that DNAPL may be present. I think if you go back to the September meeting, I pointed to 2 wells, W4 and PW4. The offsite well W4 had 4,000 parts per billion, I believe it was, when we started pumping, and within 10 or 15 years, that had been reduced to less than the Ontario drinking water standard of 80 parts per billion. And I contrasted that with PW4, which is on site and had similar high concentrations in the many thousands of parts per billion, yet those still persist to today, which leads me to infer that there is an ongoing source of chlorobenzene on the property in the municipal aquifer, probably a residual NAPL.
Yeah, and just to follow up, off-site, W4 has since been has ceased operation, and the area has continued to produce groundwater results for chlorobenzene that are less than the drinking water standard. I think it's been more than 5 years, correct, Alan? Since we
like 2017, I think it was 2017.
Yeah. So the inference there would be that there is no off-site DNAPL. Is that correct, Alan?
There is another area that does have high chlorobenzene concentrations. That's where we've put in the extraction well W8. That well has not been operating as long as the other wells. I think that one again started in the mid 2010s. Concentrations were around between 2,500 and 4,000. looking at, and that was like 2018, like a few years ago. This year, I think we're under 2,000, but we're still above 1,000. So I think the jury is still out as to whether there would be a source or a DNAPL in the vicinity of W8. But I'm kind of thinking that since concentrations are coming down, that probably there isn't a residual source there, but time will tell.
Okay.
All right, thanks, guys. Oh,
yeah, sorry. And then, sorry, on effective solubilities, I know what the question's been asked. If we've determined site-specific or effective solubilities for NDMA and chlorobenzene ourselves experimentally, and the answer is we have not. With NDMA, it's essentially completely soluble in water, and that's what we're seeing with the large diffuse plume. So I don't know that there's much we would expect to happen in terms of it can't become more soluble than it is. It's effectively completely miscible in water. So we don't expect any incremental change in its solubility, and that's what we're seeing, and it fits with what we're seeing off site. With respect to chlorobenzene, we haven't determined its solubility in groundwater either on site or off site. But what we have seen in literature is that you usually require the presence of another co-solvent in a percent range or higher. So we're talking about thousands of parts per million, not parts per billion, but thousands of parts per million, before you start to see effects or changes in the solubility of chemical constituents experimentally. That doesn't speak to what would happen on site, but it's just talking generally, that's what one sees experimentally. You need a lot of the presence of another co-solvent before you start to see solubility changes, depending on the chemical one is interested in.
All right, thanks, guys. I'll open it up to questions. Sebastian, I saw that you threw your hand up there.
Quick question, guys. In the draft response, you mentioned that PW4 and W4 strongly suggested that DNAPLs were still on site in quantity, but not off site. How representative is PW4 and W4 in this relationship? You've only used a couple of sources here. And from that, you've extracted the conclusion that there are no DNAPLs with Allen's now caveat at W8, that there are no DNAPLs outside of or off-site. And again, I'm just wondering, aren't you inferring a little bit too much from the basis of a very small sample?
No.
Can you explain that, Alan?
We have a monitoring well network of, 100 off-site locations. And when we detect a compound like chlorobenzene, we typically try to delineate that. That would include going down gradient and finding where there is no more of it left, but also going up gradient and looking for the source. So I don't believe we have a reasonably good explanation as to how DNAPL could have transported itself out to W4, and that makes good sense to me. But we have, as I say, 80 or more other wells out there that are not indicating high concentrations of chlorobenzene. So that's why I'm quite confident that there's nothing out there that that I don't think we've missed anything.
Yeah, that, and I think if I can add, Alan, just if there was a persistent DNAPL off-site, you wouldn't expect to see significant reductions in the chlorobenzene plume. And as we look at the AMR and look at what's happened to chlorobenzene off-site, it's literally being pulled back to the site and has disappeared. If you remember Joe Ricker's analysis, that's the he does that plume subtraction map where when things are have been removed or eliminated, it gets dark blue. That's the mapping where you see the original plume almost completely disappear from where it was, and it only exists kind of in and around W8 and there's a small little lobe over by moving towards W3, and I think some residual chlorobenzene around 5A. But again, you wouldn't see it continue to reduce. Think about just if DNAPL is present, you have a constant addition of material, of source to the aquifer. It's always going to keep adding, right? And we're removing, but we're not, we can attest, we're not removing at a rapid rate. If we were, we would have been cleaned up years ago. So, and we're not seeing that persistent chlorobenzene. And like I said, when you look at the plume analytics and the conclusions of Joe Ricker, that also supports and buttresses our position with respect to offsite.
Any other questions or comments?
All I can say is, I'm hoping you're correct. And the evidence and the evidence seems to suggest that. I'm just a little bit surprised because the amount of chlorobenzene that was used by the plant was pretty substantial over the course of decades. And some of that would have gone off-site over time. And because of the density level of chlorobenzene, it's greater than 1, it would have sunk. It becomes a DNAPL at some point. And its insolubility means that it's not easy to move. So if you've already got a fair amount of this stuff in the aquifers, it's hard for it to be removed with the current processes that we have. But the evidence suggests that you outlined suggests that it isn't there to anywhere near the degree that it probably once was. And if that is actually the case, wonderful, great. But I'm hoping, I'm not entirely convinced, let's put it that way, that that's the case, simply because of the nature of chlorobenzene as a DNAPL.
Thanks, Sebastian. Any other comments from committee on this one? I do note that in item 9.2, which is correspondence from Mr. Alan Marshall, this same concern was noted. And so I just wanted to, it's not an excerpt, but I did summarize one of the concerns that I think had been kind of discussed, but I wanted to provide an opportunity just to answer this question. So specifically, can you explain the technical details behind how you've determined DNAPLs aren't present? Specifically, there's concern around whether or not you relied on aqueous solubility of chlorobenzene and NDMA or the effective solubility when interpreting the groundwater data. And maybe you could start by kind of delineating between the effective solubility versus the aqueous solubility for people like me who may not have that information at their fingertips.
Okay, well, aqueous solubility, I'm not a chemist. I hang around with some chemists. Aqueous solubility is the ability of the solvent to dissolve in water. Effective solubility, I'm assuming, is that same measure, but in the presence of other solvents, which may increase or decrease that solubility. I'm sorry, I just don't. Those are the definitions that I would work with. I don't have a dictionary here in front of me. And the other part of that question, I don't really rely on solubility to determine the extent of a plume, or maybe to determine how close you are to a source, potentially. But I look at the concentrations, And if those concentrations are being reduced over time, then I'm pretty confident that there's no DNAPL source there, that it is simply the dissolved phase and some dissolved phase sorbed onto the soil, but not any pure solvent.
Okay, thanks for that. Any other questions? Not seeing any, gentlemen. I think there may have been one more, or was that it? I think the one didn't really have much.
Yeah,
to it.
there was a request, sorry if the last slide, the request for monitoring well details. So GHD does maintain a list of monitoring wells and their completion details. And we have all the logs for all the wells that have been completed by, LANXESS and by others, the region, and also has wells and it's completed wells as well. And we have access to those. We have shared that in the past as part of EDAT, a data access tool. We can probably export what we have from there to TAG. It may be missing a couple of wells because we haven't updated that, but if that's useful and is something that TAG would like, we can definitely do that and share that with share that again with you. So, but it's a long list. It's a big list. But obviously, again, this is all public information that has been provided previously. We can look at doing an export and getting that to you if that would be helpful. But we don't have a log that's been requested or a log, Tiffany, that you've asked for. We don't have something. The closest thing we have is EDAT, and we can try and export what we have and give it to you, and hopefully that'll be useful to you.
Yeah, definitely. You did provide the EDAT on a CD or DVD a few years back. And I think what you said at the time was basically it gets updated annually. Am I remembering that correctly?
Yeah, we were doing that up until recently, but we've stopped doing it. I don't believe we've added a lot of new wells since then, but there may be a handful, like maybe 5 or 6 that aren't on there. And again, we can share that with you, and we can maybe provide you with the logs for the ones that are missing, and just export that in an Excel file to you, if that would prove helpful.
Yeah, I mean, apart from just having a more current version of it, I'm not sure. I guess what would be really, really nice is if there was like an online sort of interactive GIS-based way of quickly finding a particular well when it gets referenced in the text. Because,
Yeah.
going back and forth to a figure, it gets tricky, and sometimes the labels aren't completely visible.
Yeah.
So it's hard to find them. I guess that's where the question is coming from.
We can discuss that as well with, I don't want to put Hadley on the spot, but we can discuss that with Hadley as well. I don't know where we are. I know Hadley has talked about taking us maybe there with GIS and doing something with an updated model and getting an updated GIS. Nothing's concrete yet. I don't want to put you on the spot, Hadley, but maybe.
No, it's fair. I mean, there is a model, what is it, 2018 circa 3D model, and I think it's a useful tool. I think Ramin historically, he used it, but then he moved to Joe's analysis, which is also helpful, but they show kind of two different things. So let me see where we could get the GIS model. It's not quick. It's not a quick turnaround, but see where we can get it and if we can get it in a shareable format.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you very much for that.
And
all right,
I think that's it.
Yeah, I was going to say, are there any final questions for either Alan or Lou or Hadley for that matter? Not seeing any. Thanks very much, gentlemen. So that brings us to item 5.2.5 on the agenda, which is the fish tissue design.
Yes. And this is just a little more information. You got it right before we had our last meeting. I don't know if people have had a chance to look at it. I think it was Ryan who had the specific questions. He's not on today, is that right? Or is he there?
No, Ryan's on.
Oh, okay, great. I think, did Joe Keen reach out to you? Ryan, he was going to.
He was on, he may have just stepped away, so we won't put him on the spot.
Okay, thank you. He was going to reach out one-on-one just to make sure he answered all the questions, but for the larger group as well. This is again, we're hoping we've sent the proposal into the ministry for their review and hopeful approval. We're hoping to change the condition for 17 parenthesis 2 for the cage clam study to fish tissue study. And it would be in conjunction with the biomonitoring survey. So the biomonitoring, we're catching fish in order to say what species are there. And then every 6 years, we would be catching them and actually taking them in for laboratory analysis of the fish tissue itself to see if they have any of the compounds in them and at what concentrations. And we're hoping to collect small-bodied fish that are benthivores and I'm not even going to try that one, detritivores, and they're closely associated with the aquatic sediments within the creek. So they'd be eating the bugs that are living off of the sediments and so forth. And Stantec has produced this study. They feel that it would be unlikely to negatively impact the fish populations in the long term if we collect them once every 6 years. So we would be taking, it's a composite sample of different fish species trying to find the number of stretches. Is it the 4 full stretches that we have here?
I thought it was Hadley is blue. I thought it was focused again primarily to the site and then just downstream.
Right, but they're in certain. He is still in reaches. That's where I'm confusing myself on the details of this.
I think I don't know if Joe meant it to go all the way to the Grand River.
No, it doesn't go to the Grand River. It models what the clams are, which, like you said, it's closer to the creek. To the site itself.
Yeah.
So we talk about some of the. Oh, I'm getting the low PC again. Some of the species we're hoping to collect, and we're going to catch as many as we need to make the composite sample in order to meet the lab's objectives so that they have enough material to work with, the desired wet weight. And we plan to do a total of 3 replicate samples of the whole body of each fish, of the the composite samples from the 4 reaches. That's what I'm trying to get, that are up near the plant. It's not the same reaches we use in the human health risk assessment. And we need the certain weight in order to achieve the desired low detection limits for the constituents of concern. Are there any questions? I know I went through that pretty quickly.
Seeing any, Hadley?
Okay, great.
Why don't we move on to item 5.2.6, which is the HHERA, sorry.
I think I spoke a lot about that earlier. We're hoping to work with the ministry to submit a new work plan based on where we have the highest detections from the current data set and do some step out delineations in those areas of soil and sediment for the sediment constituents, dioxins, furans, DDT, and work from there. And so that hopefully we can get that work plan in maybe early next year, hopefully gain approval so that it can be a 2025 sampling event. That does not by all mean that we would have the risk assessment ready for resubmittal at the end of 2025. It'll depend on when we get the data and putting it together.
This is still a ways out then.
Yes. Yep.
Okay.
Yep. I imagine there'll be some back and forth with the work plan on gaining approval. So I think it's something we had worked to talk about what our agendas will look like for the next meetings over the 2025. And this is something for sure, we're going to continue working on, and we should continue discussing. But it's we're still working through the resolution.
I don't see any questions on that item, Hadley. So I think the last item we have, which we've also spoke briefly about, is item 5.2.8, which is the replacement of the on-site containment well, PW5 with PW6.
Lou, do you have
Yeah,
anything else to add? Yep.
Yeah, again, we're just, the final connections have been made. We're installing the pump this week, and we just have to go through process safety review at the plant, and we'll we're hoping to turn that on as early as next week.
Great news, guys. Thanks. Any other questions? All right, thanks very much, Hadley and others, for those detailed updates. It took a while, but we got through it. It brings us to item 6, though, which is scheduling TRAC's 2025 meeting dates and setting some preliminary agendas. So I'm going to turn it over to Tiffany for this one.
Okay, just to share how the process has gone to get us to this point. You should see in your package proposed TRAC meeting schedule for 2025 and draft agenda items. Chair Nathan and myself and Hadley from LANXESS, we had a first go at this and looking at the most likely timing for the various items that were on the 2025 work plan there, and sort of trying to align them as best we could with meeting dates and the number of meetings that our terms of reference requires, and also presentations to council. So that's sort of what our objective was in drafting this. We then also forwarded this to the Ministry of Environment, as some of the items here obviously rely on the turnaround time for the ministry to have a chance to review and provide comment. So to the best of our ability, these are the proposed dates for TRAC meetings and council meetings and the agenda items. And as Hadley mentioned here earlier, the update on the human health, ecological risk assessment is an ongoing item, updates basically at each of the meetings. But you will sort of see some of the key activities, field activities, etc., that are part of next year's work plan. And right now, I think there is a preference for the third, in terms of dates, for the third Thursday of the month, but that may just be for a couple of the months here. I guess this is what we wanted to kind of bring forward to the committee to see if there were any glaring issues. I know from correspondence with Hadley that June 19th is preferred. Also with Chair Nathan here, he indicates that April 17th is the Thursday before Good Friday. So we may or may not want to have it that day, or if that's not an issue, we can keep it that day. And so if there's any particular thing that you feel are items that you feel are missing here, but we do feel that this is a fairly comprehensive idea of what we will be discussing and the timing of those items in terms of block agenda items. And obviously these agendas get prepared and reviewed before the meeting so that it's not necessarily exclusive of any other items, but this is what we're anticipating at this time.
Any feedback from the committee on this, positive, negative, or otherwise?
Also, I guess it goes without saying that Stacy, our committee support person, would circulate any reports or documents as soon as they come in. So it's not like you only get them in the agenda package, but the agenda package compiles and consolidates everything. That's going to be part of the discussion.
Just one point here, you mentioned Easter, Good Friday. Well, look at December 18th might be just a little bit close for Christmas for a lot of people as well, so we might want to review that as well.
Yeah. So maybe April and December would be the earlier dates?
No, that's
Yeah.
just a suggestion, you know.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with the suggestion. I mean, personally, it would be better for myself.
Anybody? I would agree, like if we move those 2 months up to the second, that's the second Tuesday, I think. And keep the rest on the third.
And we'll continue to confirm dates the meeting before. You know, life happens, things come up. So as that happens, if we need to adjust, we can certainly adjust. I think that this gives us a bit of direction for planning for some of these meetings as well, having some high level agenda items to really navigate that. So, you know, if something does come up over the course of the next couple of weeks or months, you know, do feel free to reach out and let us know if, you know, something twigs your memory and say, hey, I really think that maybe this should be added, or maybe we need to carve out a date and time to have more of a discussion around this. That's certainly something that we can look at. As Tiffany indicated, we are in line with the terms of reference, which is 4 meetings per year. So we have a 5th in here, which is allows us an opportunity in June, that is, to, you know, determine whether or not we want to proceed with that meeting at that time. I think that we had chose to go forward with the June meeting, really in anticipation of the council presentation that's going to be happening in August. We wanted to allow sufficient time for the committee to come together and provide some direction for what that presentation would look like. So that's the rationale, and if there isn't any more feedback, we won't spend any more time on this item. That does bring us to item 7, which is the standing item, the 2028 order deadline framework discussion. I have nothing to update the committee on for this item tonight. I know that we just met last month, so there hasn't been a lot of time to really make some progress on this. So we'll just put a placeholder in it for now, unless there are any points that you would like to make at this point. All right, is there any other business that any committee members wish to discuss? Seeing none, that brings us to item 9, which is correspondence received. So item 9.1, we are in receipt of the October progress report. Is there any feedback that any committee member wishes to provide? Tiffany?
I noted that the from the September progress report, you had hoped that the contractor was going to be on, this is directed to GHD, but the contractor would be on site for the week of October 7th. But it looks like from the October progress report that that didn't happen. And I'm just wondering, has it happened since?
Is this, Tiffany, is this for W9?
W5A, I think, and W8. Like there were issues.
Yeah, so we've determined that we've got a workaround for W8, and unfortunately W5 is happening next week.
Okay.
We've just had we're going to look into alternate suppliers of this service, and as indicated, I think, as Hadley has indicated, we're also going to be switching to a scheduled rehab schedule, or we're going to institute a scheduled rehab for offsite wells, so that we're not going to wait for them to require rehab before schedule it. We're just going to put them on a schedule next year. So we're hoping to avoid these circumstances altogether by getting commitments early and putting them on the schedule, and just rehabbing them at a frequency based on the well's performance in the last 5 to 10 years. So those are our workarounds for that. But we have struggled with contractor availability this year, and we're trying to fix that. And the last lever to pull that we're going to look at carefully is getting a second contractor as well if this keeps up.
Thanks, Lou. That's helpful.
Any other questions or comments? Seeing none, item 9.2, we have an email correspondence from Alan Marshall. I did reference this and asked one question related to the other item. Are there any other comments related to this piece of correspondence? When I was reading this, and this is for GHD, I did have one other item kind of come up that I wondered about, and it's the historical discharge volumes. And I'm wondering if you have a place where I could go to get information related to the estimated as well as the verified amounts of the contaminants that had been discharged into the aquifer, that's chlorobenzene and DMA. So if you can, and if there is access to this, what are the data source? What are the methods? What are any assumptions that were used to determine how much contamination was originally released? How much may remain in the ground? How much has been extracted and treated? And how do these figures all fit in to the overall remediation timeline and strategy? So I know that there's a lot to unpack there. And again, I'm just wondering, surely there have been reports or documents that speak to this in the past. Can you maybe highlight where I could go to find those?
Yeah, so if you focus on the AMR, up until, so there's a past AMRs where we utilized the model, we would calculate a total mass, and we still do calculate a total mass removed. And when we had the model, we would calculate a mass in place. I know with Joe Ricker and his analysis, he does a slightly different calculation. And I forget, what is it, effective mass in place? Is that right, Alan? Is that what he calls his indicator? He has a mass indicator, and it's an indicator, and it's a little bit less precise, but my recommendation would be to go to each AMR. And again, we can provide you with old ones if you need them. But if you look at AMR, the mass removed will be there and will be calculated based on concentrations in extraction wells and what's gone through the system. And then mass in place is estimated in each AMR, but depending on AMR, the Ricker analysis does it one way. When GHD was doing it with respect to the model, we did it a slightly different way. But again, the AMRs would be where you'd find that.
Okay, thanks, Lou.
Lou, would it be correct to direct Chair Nathan to the 1998 site remediation documents that sort of report on historical site activity, as well as perhaps the introductory section of the risk assessment, the draft risk assessment that's in place? It speaks to some of this as well, right?
It does, but if you're looking for amounts removed, I believe one of the questions were amounts removed as well. And those documents definitely have and discuss those. They're just a little out of date, that's all.
Okay. All right, thanks everybody for that. The last piece of correspondence, 9.3, really corresponds, if I'm not mistaken, to item 5.2.3, which is the technology evaluation update finalized. So it just included that presentation. So that brings us to the next meeting date. From what we've discussed, it will be in April, sorry, that'll be April 10th, which is the earlier date, so to not interfere with the long weekend. And that brings us to adjournment, so I will seek a motion for adjournment. Need a mover and a seconder, otherwise we're stuck here all night. Thank you, Eric. Moved by Eric, seconded by.
I just love it here, so.
I know. Eric, thank you, Eric. All those in favor? And that is carried. Thank you very much, everybody, and I will see you all in the new year.
Thank you. Have a nice holiday.
Thank you.